Good afternoon, everybody. This is just to thank you for your patience. Please put on your headsets so that you can hear. So really delighted that you're here for this presentation of the new report of the 4P Coalition, the Global Expert Review on Debt, Climate and Nature. So we're here to discuss the findings, the main findings of the new report of this coalition. My name is Piera Tortora. I'm the head of the 4P Secretariat. And I'm really delighted to be here with you today. I think this discussion is absolutely critical and timely. Just earlier this week, on Thursday, there was a new report that came out pointing to the financial needs for the climate transition and pointing to financing needs for emerging and developing countries around 2.5 trillion per year. But we know that countries, especially after 2020, have been increasingly constrained by rising debt burdens. So investigating more the relationship between debt burdens and some of the solutions to alleviate debt burdens so that countries have more fiscal space for investing in climate and development and nature is absolutely critical. And I really would like to welcome this report that really investigates the interconnections between debt burdens, climate challenges, and biodiversity loss challenges. So we have an incredible panel of speakers. You cannot see them yet, but they are on the way. And I'm really delighted now to pass the floor to Michael Jacobs, who's leading this work from the Secretariat of the Global Expert Review on Debt, Climate and Nature, and who will present the main findings from the report. Michael, very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Piera. So, in the spirit of COP, we have no paper copies of the report, but if you would like to see it, this is the QR code, and that will take you to the website with the report. I'm going to explain who the expert review is, and then the highlights, a summary of the report. So that's the QR code. I'll put it up again at the end, so if you miss it now, you will have another chance to get it. So the report is the interim report. We have a year-long process, and we are about halfway through. And the interim report is called Tackling the Vicious Circle for a reason I will explain. The expert review on debt, nature and climate was set up by 4 countries, Colombia, Kenya, France and Germany. And its goal is to examine the relationship between sovereign debt, climate change impacts and investment, and nature conservation in low and middle income countries. As Piera says, many countries now experiencing a confluence of these issues. It has a secretariat made up of research institutes from 4 research institutes, CEPAL-ECLAC, which is the Economic Commission for Latin America, ODI Global, based in London, the Finance for Development Lab, based in Paris, and the Africa Center for Economic Transformation, based in Accra, in Ghana. And this is the panel of independent experts who are doing the work, drawn from across the world, different backgrounds in the fields of debt, nature and climate. The idea is to provide an independent assessment of these issues, drawn from expertise of various kinds. So we start off by describing what we call the triple crisis. In many emerging and developing economies, 3 different crises are now being experienced simultaneously, and they are interacting with one another. So the first is the biodiversity and ecosystems crisis, in which we see ecosystems being lost. there are really horrific declines in wildlife as indicators of wider biodiversity and nature issues. Secondly, we have climate change impacts occurring now, drastically affecting agricultural water systems, causing more frequent climate extreme weather events. This is a graphic from the IPCC showing the kinds of impacts which are now occurring. And thirdly, these impacts, the nature and climate impacts, are interacting with one another. We have impacts that are really now both. And thirdly, many countries, not all, are experiencing debt problems. We have now around a quarter of EMDEs which are described by the IMF as either in debt distress, meaning that they are struggling to pay their debts, or they are at risk, high risk of debt distress. And this is the context in which many developing countries now find themselves. And this chart shows the kinds of increases in debt payments which are being made. We are glad to welcome Kevin Magran, French climate envoy, to the stage. So we have what we describe in the report as a triple crisis now afflicting a number of countries. But these three crises are not independent of one another. And the analysis that we have been we have been doing in this first phase is of how these three crises interact. And we describe this as a vicious circle, in which, to give you an example of how this works, if you are an indebted country, you have little fiscal space to spend on climate resilience and nature impacts, and indeed on economic development. That means that you are not as resilient to climate impacts and to nature loss as you could be. That means that your growth may be hit by an extreme weather event or by the loss of agricultural or water systems. That makes your debt more risky. That means you're going to pay more for your debt, which means that your fiscal space will be even less. This vicious circle means that many countries are kind of trapped, and this is what creates the specific problem. But there is a virtuous circle. If you can invest in nature resilience and climate resilience, you will become better growth prospects. Your debt will therefore be cheaper. You will then have more fiscal space to invest in climate resilience and in growth, and you will look better. So effectively, what our report suggests is we need to help countries move from a vicious circle of debt, nature, and climate towards a virtuous one. But to do that, they need the financing to start with. And this is the problem that many countries are facing now, higher debt costs they had before because of the rise of the dollar and of global interest rates. So we need to get and into the virtuous one. And that's the core message of our report, and we have this in some depth in the analysis in the report. So that's the countries to be on, in which economic dynamism enables you to spend more on nature and climate, which enables you then to be more resilient and to get better debt terms. Because this is the interim report, our main focus is on diagnosis of the problems, and this is the vicious. We focused our first set of recommendations on the very important debt sustainability frameworks which the IMF and the World Bank use to assess countries' debt prospects and growth prospects. Many countries, particularly in Africa, do not access, so they can't access private debt. If you're an income country, is that better? If you are a middle-income country, you can access private markets, although they have become much more expensive, and some did have market access, no longer have it since the pandemic. If you are a lower-income country, you are very dependent on public finance, and the IMF is then the gatekeeper and the judge of your risk, of the risk of your debt. And the IMF and the World Bank use something called the Debt Sustainability Framework, which is an analysis of your growth prospects as a country, and therefore the riskiness of your debt, and therefore the cost of your debt. And so the IMF and the World Bank's debt sustainability frameworks become really critical to your prospects of getting debt. And even if you are a market access country, the credit rating agencies are looking at the debt sustainability frameworks. But the problem, I mean, there are a number of problems with this framework and with the role of the IMF and the World Bank, but the specific problem here is they don't properly take into account the relationship between debt, nature, and climate. These are traditional macroeconomic models which have not included environmental factors, and therefore we have two failures, one on the risk side, but one on the benefit side. So on the risk side, the extra risk that you as a climate vulnerable country or as a country which may experience further nature loss are going to have to your future growth prospects are not being properly measured. But on the investment side, nor is the spending that you might do on nature conservation or climate adaptation and resilience. So if you have a nature conservation program, for example, arising out of your COP16, your biodiversity COP commitments, or you have a nationally determined contribution plan for adaptation or resilience, or indeed for green energy, these are included here, despite the fact that they will reduce your future risk. So we need the IMF and the World Bank to be beginning to take into account these additional risks and additional benefits from spending. And so we have made a number of recommendations on how they can do this. The good news is that the IMF and the World Bank are interested in this. They know they are not getting this right. And they have agreed, partly as a result of the work that we have been doing and partly as a result of other people pointing this out to them, this is not rocket science, as it were, that they need to do this. And so the IMF and the World Bank are beginning to review their methods, and we are asking them to take climate impacts, nature impacts better into account, both on the side of risk and on the side of spending. This will enable countries to have the incentive to invest in resilience spending and nature conservation because it will help their credit rating agencies and their debt sustainability. So we have a number of recommendations in this. Where we're going next, I will explain. You can just have a look at this. This is really crucial that the scenarios that they paint include these risks and the value of this spending, and this is what we are proposing. So we are the expert review is a year-long process. We're about halfway through. We intend to publish a final report in April next year. And we're looking at the ways in which the international community and national governments can address the triple crisis, address the interrelationship between these crises, how they can issue new debt which takes into account nature and climate spending. So, for example, Uruguay last year issued a sustainability-linked bond, which has two interest rates. It has one, which they will pay if they meet a set of key performance indicators relating to economic development, environmental conservation, adaptation, and a higher interest rate if they don't. So they are now very strongly incentivized by having debt related to their climate and nature plans. They are very strongly incentivized to do that. There's also the field of debt and nature swaps, where countries are exchanging some old debt for new debt, getting some credit enhancement or some other improvement in the terms, and that releases money that can then be spent on nature conservation or climate work. Ecuador did quite a famous debt swap recently, which has gone to protecting the Galapagos Islands, nature conservation. Belize has done one of these, and other countries, including Colombia, are looking at how they can restructure their debt in order to release money for a national plan which includes climate resilience and nature and spending. So we will be looking at those. And thirdly, there is a more general question, which is there a new general mechanism which could support these countries that are now really in debt problems. So some years back we had the highly indebted, the HIPIC, the highly indebted program. Is there another program that we could examine this? So we will be looking at these, and we will come up with recommendations in next April in, we hope, all of these areas addressed to creditor countries, to borrower countries, to the IMF, the World Bank, and the credit rating agencies. So this is a big agenda. QR. We are indebted to France, Colombia, Kenya, and Germany for stimulating this report. We hope to put this on the agenda of the G20, of the G24, of the G7, of the IMF and the World Bank. Experience very difficult issues over the next 2 years as debt redemptions become due. So we hope this is a contribution to the debate. And I'm very glad to say that Kevin is here to relieve me on the stage.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this extremely interesting presentation. I really would like to commend the expert group for this report that really sheds light on the interrelations between debt issues and climate and nature, but also provides some initial reflections on how both climate risks and climate opportunities from decarbonization need to be included, for instance, in DSAs. I'm so happy to be joined by Kevin Magran, who's the climate envoy for France. Kevin, France has been incredibly supportive of this process, and more broadly also is really at the origin of the 4P, which is the umbrella initiative for this work. And you personally have been an incredible driving force for all of this. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. And can you please tell us a little bit more about why France is supporting this, why France believes that this is so critical at this point in time?
Thank you, Pierre, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, Michael, and thank you so much. I mean, first of all, I'm gonna have to run again, and this is the way at COP we run from one place to another. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that I have to deliver another speech on innovative finance for climate and development. And this is the very message I wanted to bring today. First, I want to commend Colombia, Kenya, my friends in the room, and Germany to be with us in this journey. As you said, Pierre, we initiated this coalition last year at COP28, and we're very happy of the progress made, of the results, and I think the report speaks of itself. So a great appreciation to the leadership of our partner. Second, I think it's important to recall the 4P because Pierre, you are now our 4P ambassador, so to speak, and the Secretariat is working with all our partners in the different coalitions. But we think the debt issue is absolutely critical to what we're doing here. And inside the 4P, we want to give a special place also to this issue. We can sit. I'm a climate negotiator. You know, I'm going to be here working on NCQG and on the finance. And it's impossible to address this if you overlook one very major issue for so many countries in developing world. Because we want an ambitious but achievable target here on the NCQG, but we have to address also the structural problems and the deeper roots of this issue. I just want to say also that we believe this report is a beginning, and we have now a shared diagnosis that is posed very quickly, but it's not a comprehensive answer. There are many elements to it we can still bring. The report has highlighted evidences of the nexus of climate, biodiversity, and debt, as I was saying. And so we want also to acknowledge that the situation of all developing countries are not the same. They are very heterogeneous. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution in this finance space. We have to look at every and individual position and situation. And we see that sometimes certain countries face specific debt pressure that need also treating on a case-to-case basis. And finally, I want to tell you that this report makes an important recommendation, we think, on the debt sustainability analysis. We support greater inclusion of climate and nature within that frameworks, and the fund and bank are already working on this topic, having published a guidance note on this summer on the climate risk in the DSA. So we really hope that the IMF and the World Bank will consider the suggestion put forward in the report, and that we can move forward. And finally, we look forward to the release of the full report, Michael, with such an impressive work. But also the full report of the IMF and the World Bank spring meetings. We hope it will provide a technical analysis of broader debt issues, including the debt optimization and the structuring. So that's it for me, Pierre, but I just want to testimony, even running from one side to another, I really wanted to be here. Even if you're late, you have to show where the priorities lie, and I think my heart is here, and Pierre, I'm sure you can bring that meeting even more forward. I commend again all my partners in the room.
Thank you so much, and thank you for making the time for being with us in your very busy schedule. We're absolutely delighted that you were able to join us. I would like now to invite Stacey Swan to join us on the stage. Stacey, you're the founder of the Resilient Earth Capital and the former CEO of Climate Finance Advisors, and you're also a member of the expert group that produced this report. So Stacey, I'm absolutely delighted that you can join us, and thank you so much for the incredible work that you have been doing for the expert group. Perhaps with you, we could go a little bit into what is the private sector perspective in this, and how can we use this report and this work more broadly, which we know, this report is just one of the steps of the work of the coalition. How can we use this also to engage with the private sector and bring them on board? Thank you, Stacey.
Okay, so thank you for having me, and I will say the kind of first half of this report has been an incredible journey with the other members of the group, because there are a lot of diverse viewpoints that are brought together that have resulted in the great recommendations that you saw on the slide. And I don't know, Michael, if we could put up the circle, because the circle is quite a nice visual to articulate what I think we all know. Depending, it doesn't matter where you sit. If you're in the, if you're in policy, if you're in the public sector, if you're in public finance. Yeah, I love the circle. There we go. So Michael articulated what I think is kind of a big picture headline, which is that countries, and particularly countries in emerging markets, 25% of them are either already debt distressed or at risk of being debt distressed because of the vicious circle that you see up here. And if you walk through each one of those points, you see the connection between the accelerated warming that we're experiencing from climate change and the inability to get out in front of development for economic growth, right? And these are all very connected. So our work is very kind of macro-oriented from a public policy and public finance perspective, but it's absolutely necessary context and framing for having any discussion about mobilizing private sector capital, either internationally or domestically from the ground up, and why, right? So if you start at the top, climate and nature shocks and stresses are happening, and warming is accelerating, and the impacts of that warming are accumulating, and each one of those impacts is costly. And it costs the public balance sheet, and it costs economic activity and private sector, right? So the costs are being borne by a number of different balance sheets along the way. And this creates headwinds for investment. So, a number of you have been here at COP for the last 2 to 3 days. Yesterday or the day before, I'm losing track of days, was Finance Day. This COP is called the Finance COP. At the center of the discussions of the Finance COP is how to unlock private capital. The reason why that's at the center is because there aren't balance sheet resources enough anywhere in any country, in the north or the south, or north-south flows, that can solve the climate crisis, right? We need both public and we need private capital. But the public capital and the public balance sheet is a pretty unique source of capital in terms of how it can unlock private capital. And if your public balance sheet is constrained because of these headwinds, you have an even greater challenge to attracting private capital. And that, I think, is pretty well articulated in how the rest of this circle kind of plays out. Just to kind of illustrate what that then means for private sector, I'm going to walk down from the top to the bottom. Avi, come up here. I'm going to ask you the important questions next. So obviously, if you have the context of kind of the public balance sheet being strained in emerging markets, that affects the credit rating. The credit rating at the sovereign level affects any country's ability to attract private capital, either for big infrastructure projects or for specific private sector investments. It's almost like a gating item. If your country's sovereign rating is downgraded or you are in debt distress, your ability to attract private capital at a risk-adjusted cost that's absorbable is constrained at best, limited at worst, limited in the middle, and maybe non-existent at worst, right? And then, so you have this circumstance where you're constrained at the public balance sheet, you're constrained in terms of raising private capital, and then you have to not only play defense because of these headwinds, but your ability to play offense. When I think of offense, I think of country planning and NDCs and all of the pipelines that are built, hopefully underpinning those NDCs need to be financed, and they come across a spectrum of sectors which have varying potentials for attracting private capital. What do I mean by that? It's pretty easy, relatively speaking, to attract private investment for energy and infrastructure. It's very difficult for nature-based solutions. The nature-based solutions don't always have revenue streams that enable you to attract private capital. We've got a lot of really innovative ideas that have been out there that can do that these days, and you spoke about the debt for nature swaps, Michael. But on a spectrum, there are some sectors you can invest in where you can take the public balance sheet, and a little bit of public balance sheet capital can go a long way to attracting private capital in an energy infrastructure investment. But you have to spend more of your public capital for nature, maybe water. Water in a lot of countries is not revenue generating or not sufficiently revenue generating enough to attract private capital. Maybe agriculture, right? So you have to think about how you're applying your public balance sheet in a very strategic way to unlock the private capital. And you have to do this now in many emerging markets with the context of, right, with these headwinds kind of essentially kind of pushing you back further and potential for you to be able to do this. And that's going to get ever more challenging, I think. And that sitting in the shoes of either a private investor project in an emerging market means that you're now kind of doubly or triply kind of challenged in terms of creating private investment. I think I'll stop. So our panelists have made it. And we can go round robin. I'm filling some time, Avi. I'm learning from the best.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Thank you for bringing also the perspective of the private sector. And I'm really delighted to be joined by two distinguished speakers. I would like to give the floor first to the Minister of Colombia, Susana Mohammed. Thank you so much, Colombia, for the leadership that you are demonstrating in this exercise, and also more broadly in the Paris Pact for People and the Planet, of which you are also a founding member. So really fantastic to have you with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you in terms of what does Colombia see as the relevance and value of this report, and how can we use the coalition and its next steps really to make an important contribution to the COPs, also in view of the COP 30 and also FFD4, so the key milestones for the financing for sustainable development and climate and development. So thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we have scheduled this for 2 o'clock, so we didn't know that it started here, so apologize for that confusion, but according to our schedule, we are super in time. So sorry for all of you that are here. First, I would like to thank our partners, our government of France, Germany, and Kenya, for this joint effort, which we think is very relevant to the current discussion here at COP29. And also congratulate the expert panel. I have read the interim report, which I think makes a very accurate diagnosis of the situation. And from a Colombian perspective, it describes clearly the situation we are in. A situation where we are after COVID especially, and with the inflation situation that happened in the world due to the war in Ukraine, plus the situation of climate shocks that since 2022 onwards had been unstoppable. We received the government with flooding, we continued with El Niño, very strong Niño, droughts, lack of water in many places, almost a third of municipalities of Colombia without water in between January and April of this year. Then we went to wildfires because of the drought. And now that the rain comes, since the territory was so dry, now we're having extreme flooding and at the same time lack of water in the main city, Bogota, with a shortage of water every 2 weeks because our reserves are depleting and we're going to go to the next dry season. So it's been shock after shock. Just this last one that is happening, especially in the region where we had COP16 in the Pacific, has affected 150,000 people, and we have to just get $400 million that are not in the budget, but we have to get them to respond to the crisis. And this has been at least, now if I count annually for this government, it has been around $400 million annually that are not in the budget to respond to climate shocks. In a fiscal constrained situation because of the high interest rates in the US, the high interest rates of our banks ended up creating also a very slow growth of the economy, which actually at the end always the IMF and the banks say, oh yeah, but what you have to pursue is growth. And we say, yeah, easy, let's pursue growth with the fiscal constraint, with the situation of inflation, with the interest rates, and with the situation of accumulated debt after COVID. So the vicious circle that is described in the report is absolutely relevant to the current situation of Colombia, a country that is not hiding away from the climate transition, that actually sees an opportunity in the climate transition, that has developed a portfolio of investment for the whole of economy transition, that actually, and this is another very insightful situation, very unique to Colombia, but is not very voiced in the general discussion, a country that depends on its fiscal income from the export of coal and fossil fuels. And as the markets also will be closing in the next 15 years because of decarbonization, the question is how do we invest in the alternative sectors that have to give support to the future economy of Colombia. So we see the opportunity, but we have to make a strong jump. We have the plans to make the strong jump, but we don't have the access to capital. Right now, the cost of capital for us is 10%. It's very expensive for a middle-income country like Colombia. And all the time, the risk credit and investment agencies are asking us, well, if you get out of fossil fuels, how are you going to pay your debt? And it's like, okay, this is, maybe ask us, how are we going to pay our debt in 15 years when we don't have an export market? And so this is the vicious circle. And now, what is the conclusion that we are drawing for all of that, from all of that? We see the new climate economy as an opportunity, and we have the assets to mobilize that. We have the capacity for renewables, we have the minerals, and we have the biodiversity for a set of sectors. But we need investment that is concessional for increasing the public capacity of investment, and plus investment with a lower rate, because we cannot get more debt. Otherwise, our fiscal balance is shifted. So we are in a labyrinth. So that's my final comment. So when I see the report and I see the description of the diagnosis, I see that is very accurate. And I think it's a great contribution for the global discussion. But when I see where the recommendations are heading, I see them very, I'm trying to find the word, I have it in Spanish, but I'm trying to find the word in English. Yes, like not so strong. Like no so deep at the scale of the situation. And I think we can be more bold from this panel we need groundbreaking recommendations. We need recommendations that help to shift the rules of the game, because the current financial rules are not adequate to the situation, which is not unique to Colombia. This debt situation is piling up, as the report states, to many countries. And what we cannot afford is to have a debt crisis with the climate crisis coming together. That will be catastrophic from everybody and very difficult to recover. So, for example, is it possible, I asked the panel to see if we can study this further, is it possible, and how can we do this, to bring creditors, multilaterals, and the countries, and through, I don't know which UN mechanism or which type of forum, create a pact for the climate transition, where part of that debt that we have, that debt flow that we have to pay every year from our budgets, is redirected to climate investment for the transition that will create a process, and for that the countries have to have investment plans, a clear strategy. It's not random, it's not just money to be allocated anywhere, but that can be allocated strategically, so we can create the conditions for further growth in the climate perspective. Decarbonize, inclusive, with strong natural assets that can hold our resiliency. And can we have that for 10, 15 years, which is more or less what the transition requires? So that is a stable flow of capital at a very low rate that can be used for the climate transition, and that helps to create fiscal capacity and capacity of the state. Can we do something like that? What is the role of SDRs in creating access to capital at rates? What is the level of concessional finance or very low rate finance that we can put in development banks to create the capacities of investments, and what are the terms of those conditions to create better capacity? So right now, I see the recommendations are very focused on the instruments of how debt is evaluated and how to change that. And I think that's a part of the puzzle, but it's very short from the real situation. And I will ask the panel to be more ambitious in groundbreaking and creating possibilities that really help us in this very difficult situation.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you for giving us such a vivid picture of how the vicious cycle actually plays out in reality in countries, and also for your call for having more ambition. And I think I will turn that question to Avinash, because Avinash Persad, he's the special advisor on climate change to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, but you're also part of the expert group. So I think you're fantastically placed. Avinash, can we actually raise the level of ambition in the next phase? We know that this is just a start. Actually, another report is coming out in April, which will look more in depth into the solutions. But can we actually also raise the level of ambition? Thank you so much.
Well, that all from the Minister. IDB, is this working? At the IDB, we have recently done several debt swaps. Points. Shall I come and sit here? So we've recently done a $1.6 billion debt swap in Ecuador with the proceeds going towards nature investments in the Galapagos elsewhere. We've done a very innovative debt swap in Barbados where we're managing to capitalize the interest savings so we can invest heavily in water management, waste management. But I think there are limitations to how much we can use these debt swaps, which I'll mention a bit before. But I want to mention maybe 2 or 3 things. As you say, Minister, the report goes into some very interesting diagnosis. And when I think about climate and nature finance, what's very interesting is that many of these numbers get merged in together, and people think of them all as very similar things, but they're often very different. Climate mitigation finance, if we don't, we have needs, big needs, and if we don't achieve those needs, we know we're going to not mitigate enough. We're going to create more climate change. We need to have big needs on adaptation. If we don't adapt enough, we're going to have more climate loss and damage. The climate loss and damage figure, though, is a different number. It's not an aspirational number. When we say there's $100 billion of climate loss and damage per year, that is a number that is being financed today. It's being fully financed. It's being financed by the poorest people in the world. They are paying for climate loss and damage. They're paying for it in full. They're paying for it in their lost livelihoods, in their lost jobs, in their lost income, in their lost homes, in increased risk. It's being paid, but it's being paid by the wrong people. So that is, and so governments, in trying to protect the most vulnerable people, end up with debt. A recent study showed that 50% of the increase of debt in climate vulnerable countries, 50%, is a result of dealing with the aftermath of some kind of natural disaster. I remember seeing that number and being quite struck by it at the time. I didn't work for a development bank, I worked for a country, and whenever we went to try and deal with our debt to the authorities will look at us and say, well, you've got all this debt because you're really bad at managing your affairs, and you need to get help in thinking better about your policies and your and now with this number we were able to say, well, you've got this debt because of the creditors of actually in their growth and development have helped to create this problem that we're suffering from. And that helped to change the conversation at least. But the challenge with the debt is that the private sector does not want us to cancel their debt or swap their debt. And that is fine for us to do it. We could do it, or we could do it unilaterally if we don't need to borrow again. But we can't go around canceling debt from the private sector debt and then go back to them the next year and say, can we borrow some more money from you? Because then they fear we're going to cancel it again. We can swap, we can cancel public sector debt. We can cancel debt from governments, bilateral debt. That debt was often given through a political position. I mean, the British government, the French government, they're not in the business of doing investment banking. So when they lend to countries, they do it from a political position. So they can take a political position to restructure that debt. But the private sector did not lend to developing countries out of any political decision. They wanted money back, and they want a lot of money back. And so the potential for restructuring is not as large, because although there is a fair bit of bilateral government debt, the biggest debt problem we're dealing with is debt held by private creditors. So we need a solution that's sustainable. One of the very interesting things about this report is that it actually says that in the end, whatever solutions we come up with, we're going to be living with debt. So we need, a key part of debt is debt management. How do we manage this debt? So debt swaps are one way of trying to address this issue. So the interest is not going to service the debt, but going to going to service some climate or nature approach, and the multilateral development banks are playing a role there. So for those of you who are not familiar with debt swaps, essentially a development bank would say that we'll put our AAA credit rating. Let's say it's Colombia. We'll put our AAA credit rating on a Colombian issue of debt, and that means Colombia is able to issue debt at, say, 4% rather than at 8-9%, and that interest savings. So we then, with that money we've raised, we then pay back the expensive debt, and so we've made interest savings every year. Difference between 8 and 4. And we say we direct those interest savings to a climate or nature goal. But that works where there are pockets of high-yielding debt. If you've got a lot of debt, then the best solution is not to do a debt swap with a AAA-rated bank with preferred creditor status, which you will never be able to restructure again. The best thing to do, firstly, is to restructure your debt. And the challenge of developing countries is they're afraid to restructure their debt because of the consequences of restructuring their debt when they go into an IMF program. IMF programs today may be different than they were in the past, but very few governments get re-elected after an IMF program. It's not impossible. I've been part of a government that did get re-elected twice after an IMF program, but it is not easy. So I think that these are some of the challenges, but the future debt is going to be a key part of it. The amount of climate finance we need is $2.4 trillion per year. You add diversity finance, and diversity finance is critical. Biological diversity finance is critical, although at least the numbers aren't as big. But $2.4 trillion a year, we can't finance that with debt. We can't finance that with the private sector. We can't finance that with governments. So we need to break down finance so that finance is appropriate to its needs. There is a fair bit of climate and biodiversity action that generates revenue, sustainable agriculture, solar farms, wind turbines. We need to find ways of facilitating the flow of private money into those things, so that will be debt-free. We don't want to be putting precious debt and grant-based money on things the private sector can do. But the private sector is not coming as is. We need public support for that money. Then there's stuff that does not generate revenues but has a lot of savings. Public good stuff, public investment in seawalls and flood drainage systems, and that for that, it makes sense to have debt for that. The evidence is that $1 we spend on that kind of public investment generates $4 of return. There are very few things that actually have as much of a return as investment in that kind of public infrastructure. And so we could borrow money if we're being offered money, developing countries, at low cost long term. We need to be being offered instruments that are so long term that it allows the countries to capture the savings. At the moment, people tend to lend to governments short term, 5 years, 10 years. We need 50-year debt, 40-year debt to allow us to capture the savings and pay back the debt with the savings. And we need low-cost debt. Why do countries underinvest in infrastructure and resilience? Because it's too expensive. And when they're borrowing money from the marketplace at 8 or 9 or 10%, and many developing countries are paying more than that, so development banks can lend at 4%, 5%. And so we need the development banks to be 3 times bigger to doing long-term lending for this kind of public infrastructure for which there's no revenues, but they're huge savings. So I think that we need new instruments to allow us to be able to do debt sustainably. We need to find ways of doing things without debt. We need to do debt swaps where possible. And finally, I want to say something about the interim report. On this aspect, because you're quite right, the interim report is not being very ambitious because they haven't, I think, finished their full report, and it's perhaps easier to do the easy things first. So we're all waiting to see what the final report will look like, where we're having lots of debates. But a very important part of this future of managing to live with sustainable debt is this thing called disaster risk management. So one of the challenges of debt, and the minister described this challenge. So imagine there's a country which is very clear and it has a country plan on becoming more resilient, and it's got a very clear sort of investment objectives. But because it's climate vulnerable, it's got a high level of debt, a relatively high level of debt. There's no space really for investing. And the IMF and the World Bank and others use a debt sustainability analysis that basically says, very crudely, it's like many things in finance where we pretend it's very, very sophisticated and very complicated, and people will say things and the experts will say, oh, no, you can't do that. It doesn't work out. But the debt sustainability analysis is the most simple piece of arithmetic. It basically is sort of stuff that 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds learn. There's not even any derivatives or calculus. Basically, they say your debt's got to be at 60% of GDP in 15 years. That's it. So wherever you are, you got to get to 60% in 15 years. And they work out what is the surplus you need to run today in order to get your debt down to 15%. It's where, when I was a borrowing government, I found this quite weird because we could hardly predict our growth for the next 6 months, but somehow we had to have a 15-year plan that we would get our debt down to 60%. And so why 60? So 60 kind of works for some, it will not work for others, but I guess you have to have a number. And the problem with this is it actually stops us doing the prudent thing. It stops governments investing in things that will create savings by building their resilience today. On the back of prudence. On the back of prudence, they're forcing us to do imprudent things of underinvesting in resilience. So the first point of the Interim Report was to say, let's really look at this debt sustainability analysis again. And let's make sure that we have a debt sustainability analysis that takes into account an investment that creates these fiscal savings. And then we need to have a system that allows us to do that. And we can't simply do, because part of I'll finish in a moment, part of the debt sustainability analysis argument has been about, well, we must take climate into account, all the risks into account. There's a whole strong movement about greater transparency, greater realization of risks. In my experience of the DSA, working for a borrowing country, I remember people were asking the IMF, did you take climate into account when you were restructuring the part of the restructuring of the Barbados debt? And they looked at us, they looked at the press and said, yes, we took all the climate risks into account, and we concluded that instead of getting debt to 60% of GDP in 15 years, they should get debt to 50% in 15 years, meaning that we had to run even bigger primary surpluses. And so that seems perverse, and that's one thing we're trying very hard to do in the report, is make sure that the realization of climate risks does not lead to a perverse result of where we're even further forced to run greater austerity, and austerity, as the minister was saying, is not going to get us to growth. So we need an analysis that allows us to invest in the future, which will lead to growth and lead to savings, at the same time being sustainable in our debt. Because the reality is we can't run debt at 120% of GDP. We can't. Then all our interest will be going to paying for the debt and not paying for social provision of education, health, and other things. So we do need to have debt at sustainable levels, but that sustainability must be a bit smarter than the current thing. And that's the first interim report. Strong conclusion. It's a good conclusion, and let's hope the other more ambitious, bolder ones to come will be equally good.
Thank you so much, Avinash. That was fantastic. And I really liked how you said, what you said about the imprudence of not investing in climate resilience. So thank you so much. I'm really now delighted that we have the full panel. I had told you at the start that we had a stellar panel of speakers. So I think now you can really believe me. And so I'm really delighted to introduce Sem Magume Kojo from the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development development from Uganda. So Uganda is actually a country that has been grappling with increasing levels of debt. Just these days, you're discussing a decision to actually cut all external borrowing. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you how this report resonates with you, and how do you see the vicious cycle playing out in your country, but also the opportunities from this work, this evidence, and the political work that also we're going to do based on this report. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
This one is probably better.
Thank you so much, and apologies for coming late. That's number one. Apologies for getting toppling and falling down and pulling people around. Yeah, but that's okay. I come from Uganda, and the nature and biodiversity are the heart of our, economic growth, of our employment, of our human survival. That's number one. And there are a lot of things that the degradation is going on. But again, I come from the same government, the same place where government is struggling to make sure that we have enough physical space to invest in nature protection, to have investments that are green, which is difficult. And also looking at the other objectives that we have as Minister of Finance. So the money is not there. But over time recently, our debt to GDP ratio has gone very high. We have a threshold of 50%. That is what we have in our fiscal chart of responsibility, and we try to go by that. However, given that the nature, you see when we have some catastrophes coming as a result of landslides, there was a landslide recently, floods, we have to spend more than what we have, and that takes back to go to borrowing. And we've reached a point now that, you've just heard that where the agency rates, S&P and the rest are lowering us. And that makes us hard that debt even money becomes more expensive for the country. So what I'm saying here is that this report resonates strongly with our situation, and I'm sure it is strongly with situations in most of the developing countries, especially Africa, because we have to borrow money. But again, when you look at the debt sustainability analysis, you've talked about it greatly. Yes, we need to adjust. But until when? Until when? That's the question. So for me, what I bring really in this report is that, yes, the debt is going to be hard because this is money borrowed and you have to pay for it. Let's be able to consolidate our expenditure. Let's know where to put our money and invest and have returns. Let's, as governments, be able to encourage the private sector to invest in nature. For me, that's the big point. But as long as we don't move that direction as fast as possible, the MDBs, the other great financial institutions that are giving us money may not help us greatly. It's us to help ourselves. And the vicious circle will continue if we don't do that. And that's what we're telling people. In our country, we are trying, but the challenge is hard. It's going to go high, but this is where we're moving as a country. But next, Uganda also, we are coming on. We are the chairs of the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action. And deliberately in the coalition, we have a nature working group. And we are looking at all these for knowledge products. Do we understand them? Do people in that sector understand what climate change, what nature degradation and biodiversity degradation means to the debt sustainability? These are things we're talking, and then we're discussing and writing, and that's why I'm here today to discuss this. But the report clearly resonates with my country and the developing countries, and it talks very well to what we're doing in the coalition. I want to thank you.
And thank you so much also for reminding us that Uganda indeed is stepping up in the coalition of the finance ministers for climate. So you'll be co-chairing together with the Netherlands. And we really look forward to working very closely with you in the framework of this work and the 4P more broadly. We have now some time for questions. So I would like to invite any interventions. And I see that also we have a representative from Germany. I don't want to put any pressure of him, but because Germany is also one of of the 4 countries at the heart of this exercise. If you'd like to come in, you're most welcome to. So please raise your hands, and I think we have a running mic. Oh, thank you. So I don't know if Germany would like to come in first, and then...
Yeah, thank you. This does not work.
Yeah, it does.
It's working okay. I can not hear myself. That's worrying. It's irritating. Okay, now it works. So thank you. I'm Norbert Gorissen. I'm the Deputy Special Envoy for Climate in the Foreign Office. We are very proud that the work of this debt panel now eventually has started. We see that indebtedness and the relationship with climate and biodiversity is an emerging issue, that it is preventing countries from going forward. And it's a political issue, and that's why we think we need to address it also from a perspective of foreign policy and climate policy. And that's why we also think we should have some signals on that and how it should be reflected better in the outcome of this conference. This conference will for sure not come up with solutions on how to solve the indebtedness crisis, but it could provide political signals in the context of the NCQG that this is a serious problem which has to be tackled. That's why we're behind this, and we're glad to see that things are moving forward. And I think this first interim report had never intended to already provide the solutions. That was done in a quick rush, and I commend what has been said so far, and looking forward for the final outcome next year. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming in. And I also see that we have a colleague from Kenya who's there, and Kenya is the other country that has really been at the heart of this exercise. So I would like to invite our colleague Yusuf Hussein, who's working with the Climate Envoy for Kenya, to provide his perspectives.
Thank you, Piera, and thanks to the experts who are present and those that are absent, and the sponsoring countries for the effort so far. I think Mr. Susanna had really firmed up the position and the practical problem we are trying to solve in the fixture cycle. That said, the draft interim report is good. I think it meets our expectation. The advancement made on the DSF is really good. We are looking forward to the final report, which we hope is going to capture more practical and not naive solutions. I mean, we are at a juncture where we're looking at the interlinkages between that, climate and nature. And what I mean, Uganda was explaining is typically what is affecting most of the global south countries. But it's also good to acknowledge that we really need to integrate the thinking and what Avinash was explaining in the traditional finance ministries that are not really well aligned with the nexus between finance, climate, and nature. That really helps in, of late, the environment ministry, the finance ministry are stepping up, and I will really encourage them to move into that direction and not just leave to traditional finance people. Leave to the people in the space of the climate finance, but also the traditional hard transactional finance people to also integrate the idea of finance and climate, because they are intertwined, and we can only move forward when we having the Ministry of Finance understand more for the problems we are trying to engineer and solve, because we just like 4 countries, and the 4 ministries of finance in these 4 countries were the hardest to convince when we were doing the TOR and we're developing all these activities. So I would really encourage the Minister of Finance and whoever is around here from finance today to just move into that direction. The world is moving into that direction, and we hope to have a very successful full report, and we give our full backing to the experts. It's an independent expert review that can be published even without the consent of the sponsoring countries, which is a good thing. I think they're already engaging the IMF, the World Bank with this initial report, and we look forward to more of the final report. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think we have now time for a couple of questions. So I see a couple of hands. Perhaps the lady here in the front. We have a running mic. If you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Carola Mejia. I am from Bolivia. I'm a climate justice coordinator in Latindad, which has been working about these issues for a long time with other allies from civil society. I completely agree with the Minister of Colombia that the results and recommendations so far are too weak. And we are not pointing one of the elephants in the room, which is climate finance, adding to the burden in our countries. 2/3 of climate finance right now are loans. For Latin America, 81% are loans, not necessarily concessional loans. This climate finance from even multilateral development banks come especially as loans. 89% are loans. More than 70% are non-concessional loans. So the conditions within this climate finance architecture are not fair. We are the ones, without being responsible of the climate emergency, the ones that are paying. And Avinash was also saying this. We are really paying for the climate emergency and its impacts. And we are right now negotiating a new climate finance goal. I would really expect this report to give and provide some inputs and recommendations regarding what kind of climate finance do we need related to quality, not only quantity. And that is what civil society and global south countries have been negotiating and requesting. And I think that's something very important to include in the report. We hear you recommending debt swaps, debt for nature and swaps. We have been analyzing a lot of recent debt swaps. For example, we put into your consideration our analysis regarding the debt for nature swap in Galapagos, which has been announced as a really successful and big swap. But for us, it had a lot of problems related to transparency, related to the involvement of local communities. 1.5 years has passed, and there is no $1 disbursed for conservation. There are a lot of things that we need to really understand, and the principles that need to be built to use and recommend these climate debt for nature swaps that are not the real solution or the systemic solution that we want, especially for debt resolution. We are recommending a UN mechanism for the sovereign debt reform, a restructure to be more fair, to be a space where we can solve debt in a better way. And we are recommending other mechanisms that are not being discussed here. For example, new issues of a special drawing rights to tackle this climate emergency. These are mechanisms that are not going to create debt, have no conditionalities for our countries, and that are easy and fast and only depend on political will within the IMF. And of course, this could be related also to more fair distribution of this kind of instruments. We're also advocating for debt cancellation and other instruments that I think are important also to consider.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So very quickly, perhaps, and I will invite speakers to keep their question to 1 minute. We have 2 more people, perhaps. The gentleman here.
Thank you so much. My name is Juan Sebastián Valle. I'm from Colombia. I just want to make an invitation to the group of experts in the matter in relation to debt swaps, climate swaps and nature swaps. I believe it's very important to consider the notion of risk, because if we are talking about debt, we are talking about interest rates and obviously about risk. But the notion of risk has to be changed in relation to investment on sustainable actions, because just as a matter of a reflection, what is the risk of investing in the future of humankind? What is the risk of investing in the air that we need, the water? It's very important to do that. If we want to enable climate action and lessen the burden of debt, the risk notion is in the center of the discussion. So that's a very important thing. It's like a parameter that you have to think about and really consider in terms of the technical aspects that are behind the definitions of the risk. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there was another hand there, the lady in red.
Can't miss me. My name is Seher. I'm a climate policy researcher with a think tank in India. I'm based out of New Delhi, Center for Science and Environment. A lot of my colleagues are fans of your work, so Mr. Avinash. But anyway, I just had 2 questions. One actually to you maybe. I don't know if you have the answer, but would enjoy some insights and reflections on when you talked about the kind of actors that countries can afford to, not give back debt to, if we're talking about bringing different creditors to the table. You talked about how the private sector, it's not really easy to do that, but that can be done with some public government funds because there's a political premise with which this debt is given to begin with. Could you just speak to the elephant in the room of like China as one of the largest holders of developing country debt to begin with? How does that actually, what are your thoughts on that part of it? Because there is also a very different kind of political premise that comes in there, so would be curious to hear and bring that into the discussion. And the second question, very brief, promise. Because we're all here for the NCQG, as a civil society observer, that's, also what we're tracking very closely. If we can talk about this push for kind of the investment layer from certain groups versus a provision goal versus the NCQG being a more public-centered, government budget fund-centered provision goal with some kind of private leveraging aspect attached to it, but not leading it. Do you see there any kind of potential for actually bringing in some of the questions of debt that we're talking about if we're looking to call this an investment or mobilization goal? Because I feel like if we're talking about a goal that national parties are having to agree upon for climate finance and its provision, it's much harder to give a commitment or then be accountable for what is investment or what is private sector money, right? How can you guarantee the amount? It's not possible. So then what do we really think about that? Maybe I'd like to extend that to you as well as you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. So we have a very good range of questions. We have a question more on what is the link between this work and the NCQG and climate finance. We have one question also pointing to some of the criticism on debt for nature swaps, how perhaps they can work better, and also how we can tap into other instruments like new SDR issuance. We have a question around the risk notion that we can have and also on the role of other creditors. So I think I will let the expert respond, but then also invite our ministers to come in, and then we will conclude. So who would like to start? Stacey, perhaps?
Okay, so I will address some of these things, and I'll leave some of the other ones to some of the other panel members. So look, the vision here, right, of sustainable development and getting out in front of this vicious circle is realized through the strategy of the country-driven nature of how do you realize economic growth in the face of climate change. Vision to strategy is only as good as the tactics that are employed after that strategy has been developed, and those tactics run straight through the instruments of finance. And they run through the instruments of finance on the public balance sheet, and they run through how the private sector is mobilized. I want to commend, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but when you're structuring finance, whether it's a debt product, a guarantee product, equity, or grants that are meant to provide the same role and function as patient capital to catalyze private investment, you are always looking through the lens of two things: risk, and you don't have to look at risk kind of in a macro level. Private investors look at risk as revenues, costs, asset values, and they do that. The second kind of most important point is over a time horizon, right? Those instruments are invested over time horizons. So the concept of risk in finance and the concept of time horizons needs to be brought all the way through, not just from the bottom of kind of where you're structuring transactions, but all the way to the strategic vision of how do you invest in economic growth, right? The other thing, pardon? Okay, I have one more thing to say because I want to just thank the members of the governments in challenging us to be a bit more forward-leaning and note that the creditors are also investors. And we've heard this a number of times. Climate change is the single largest investment opportunity of our generation. We absolutely have to look at it through the lens of sustainability. Every investor is exposed to it, including the ones sitting at the table trying to kind of talk to us about the credit issues of emerging markets. And I think we can spin that on its head because there is no good investment without resilience and sustainability at this point.
Special drawing rights, hugely complicated. Something else like the DSA that people will look at you and wag your head and say, no, you can't do that. A special drawing right is basically your right to borrow central bank reserves from other countries, it's not free money. You're borrowing that money. And we thought it was very exciting, and indeed Barbados, when I was there, helped to put SDRs on the COP agenda. It was very exciting when short-term interest rates were near zero, because then it was almost like free money. But today, short-term interest rates are at 5%. SDRs are actually more expensive today than long-term borrowing. So we have to think about using certain instruments at the right time. Debt swaps are no panacea. We've done the most, and we're the ones telling people it's no panacea. If your debt's too expensive, you need to restructure your debt. It really is a niche product which works in certain cases. Of course, we want more grants. We would love to have grants for everything, but there aren't grants for everything. Developing countries need at least $1.3 trillion of cross-border finance in climate alone. There are other big demands in development beyond climate. The total aid budgets in the world are $200 billion. So $200 billion is all the aid, and 1.3 is your need. We need to be very strategic. We need to push. We need people in this room to argue for increase of grants, but maybe they'll increase by 10%, 20%, if we're lucky, 30%. But we need a way to allocate this money. And I argue for grants for those things that can't be funded any other way, low-cost borrowing for those things that will generate savings, and then we try to get the private sector. But my final point on the private sector is we can't persuade the private sector to do things in which they lose money in, because we say to them they should be thinking about the important value to society of biodiversity and climate. They should be, but they're not. There's no money in that social impact, unfortunately, today. So we need to find a way of galvanizing private sector capital, but we can't expect that money to come in a loss-making activity, and the market's not pricing the climate and biodiversity as we would like it to.
Thank you so much, and I hear you loud on that, but I'll go to climate financing, which my sister brought up. That's very critical for me, that the climate financing to support our fiscal deficit should come in. But, you know, I'll give you a big example. One of the things, like we're looking for at the RCF from IMF, once it comes, you need to have a program. But the program depends on your growth, the growth rate, because the growth rate, I'm from macroeconomic policy, so we're looking at growth rate, which is going to determine revenue, which is going to tax to GDP ratio. And all these are going to work against you to get a program. And RSCF is going to depend on that program. It's not coming. And in 2017, for example, our country had drought. The drought brought down growth rate to 3%. And then we had to borrow more. And from 2017 onwards, our debt to GDP ratio has been going up. And we find ourselves in more difficult situation to manage what we have. So the point that I'm bringing on the table is that we should be able to review how we give, what conditions we give to countries that are able to invest in nature and biodiversity. That's number one, and very, very, very important for me, both the governments and those creditors. Number two, like I said before, the governments and our countries should be able to prioritize the little money that we get in our domestic review, so that we can believe in ourselves. Grants are very welcome, but you said it very well. We cannot have grants for everything. I thank you.
Now the final word before we wrap up to the Minister.
No, thank you so much. I like for us to consider, because I see like a dissonance in between the moment we are living, like the era we are living, the reality of the material situation, and the financial rules of the game. And they don't seem to match. And it's like we're trying to put a triangle in a circle. And by doing that, we try to accommodate the crisis to the instruments that we know, rather than thinking, what does this crisis require? Many people have put this example before. It's like if we were going to reconstruct Europe after a war based on the old institutions. If you would be giving loans to Europe to reconstruct after a war and say, do it at this rate or that rate, when you don't even have a state, you have to rebuild. And you may think that is extreme what I'm saying, but it's not. Because creditors, the economy actors, governments, society has to realize the situation of climate change. It has to realize that we are putting out of control the planet systems that are the basis for human civilization and actually from there the economy. And we are underpinning that by the same economic process that we are moving. And we have to, it's a scale of change in a time we have according to science that cannot be put in the instruments we have. This is like the call. I am not a financier, I have no idea of the detail, and I understand that is very tricky, the situation we are in, and that is not easy answers. I will not expect, of course, the panel to come with something, but maybe to amplify the thinking and see what are the horizons on these perspectives, because it is not working, and what we are doing is getting the situation worse. You can see, we can predict that we're getting into an abyss together collectively, and we are not reacting. Somehow a premise, and that's why it's been also the call of President Petro, is to get back the control from politics. Politics understood as the perspective of where society is going, and not leave this to the logic of the markets and how they work, because they are not responding. That, I think, one. And second, I agree very much with the minister from Uganda in terms of the value in this crisis of different type of, I don't like to call them assets or resources, because actually is the livelihood, is life, but actually we are providing ecological functions that are making this crisis go less fast than if they were not there, and they have no value in the macroeconomic process. And at the same time, the countries that are putting this pollution and making all this crisis getting worse get better access and financial conditions than we do. And that is, it has no logic within the climate situation and the historic situation of climate. And I think we have to bring this to the equation. What are the instruments that we can, it's not making nature a merchandise, because that's another trap, but how do we value the ecological services that we are providing so that helps to become more resilient, because it's not only for us. If the Amazon forest is destroyed, one of the pillars, also the Congo Basin, others, the pillars of climate stability, the whole of the world will go, but what economy are we talking about? What future, what investment, what borrowing, what interest rate? I don't see that equation. So how do we keep the Amazon, how we recover it before going to the point of no return is a critical situation of humanity. It requires public investment. It can have also private opportunities, but we are not getting that capacity. And so these are some of the variables from where hopefully we can rethink a lot of these things and maybe get further thinking and analysis. And I agree with you, it cannot be seen in the short term. What is the political pact in the long term, in 10, 15 years, if we are serious with science of climate change, that would allow us to shift this situation? Because the way we are going, and we see all these reports financially, and in terms of emissions, and in terms of climate disaster, is worse and worse and worse. And I think we should consider those factors more structurally and more in long term, and what could be that political path, what could be the rules of the game, new rules of the game that allow us to get out of this abyss we are all collectively getting into.
Thank you so much, Minister. And I think we hear loud and clear your call not to go for small fixes, but really for transformational change, and this is what we need. And I think this is a very good conclusion, because I would like to remind you that this task force is actually part of the 4P, the Paris Pact for People and the Planet, which was launched last year during the Summit for a New Financing Pact. And so really at the basis of this whole exercise, there is the recognition that the financial system as it is not delivering for the people and the planet, and we need a transformation. We need an international financial system where there is more representation of developing and emerging countries, and where actually development and climate are delivered as part and an integrated agenda. So this is why we're working through many different coalitions. So this is one of the coalitions, and there's 4 countries that really are providing leadership. So Colombia, Kenya, Germany, and France, and really would like to acknowledge them. But we have today 68 countries that are part of the 4P. So we need to bring also those countries into this conversation so that we can have a breakthrough, a change. So I really look forward to working with all of you in the coming months so that we can make that happen together. Thank you so much. Thank you.